You are listening to Book Talk Bangladesh. Okay, we are live. I was thinking, did it go live? Okay. You are listening to Book Talk Bangladesh, a podcast where we bring the books of the world to Bengali readers. Similarly, we introduce the Bengali books and knowledge traditions to the global audience. Please visit our website at booktalkbd.com to find our video podcasts. We are also available on YouTube and Facebook. You can find our audio podcast on Spotify, SoundCloud, and Google Podcast. In this episode, we are going to discuss poverty in the United States. I'm your host, Firoz Alam. Joining me, sociology professor Dr. Celine-Marie Pascale from American University to discuss her latest book, Living on the Edge, When Hard Times Becomes a Way of Life. Thank you, Professor Pascal, for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Feroz.
Um, my first question usually that people from Bangladesh or around the world who don't know you personally and not familiar with your work, how would you introduce yourself to them and your work?
Hmm. Um, I think introducing myself would be very much a person who grew up in poverty, who has lived in poverty on and off through my adult life. Um, I am queer, and I didn't return to school for a graduate degree until I was 40 years old. So I'm really kind of an out of the box person when it comes to academia. And that has been both very difficult and a great gift because being out of the box in any respect enables us to see things that people in the box miss. So that is kind of a brief introduction to me. As I say in the book, I'm Buddhist. That informs everything about the way that I do my research, and I think that shows up throughout my career as well. But professionally, I'm an interpretivist sociology, which means that I study meaning making practices by examining conversations, media, various texts. And an example of what this might mean is that if you're a qualitative or quantitative sociologist and you do research, you will report that so many people said X, and you use a sample size to mitigate errors or misinformation. And the methods are more complicated than that, but I think that's the bottom line. For an interpretivist, when someone tells me X, I want to know what other kinds of knowledge and practices must exist in order for them to believe X, right? Or I look at news accounts and representations that make X acceptable and unproblematic. And since I'm really concerned with issues of inequality, I use interpretivist methods to address big questions of culture, knowledge, and power. For my recent book, this meant really looking at how structures and institutions enable, constrain, and relate and erase inequalities.
My goodness. I mean, I love your story, particularly the one when you said that you came to graduate school when you were 40. I mean, I'm the oldest in my program. So,
Ah,
when I tell them, I've got kids and, and all of that. So, but I'm also like you. I'm very glad that I came to do my PhD at a later stage. Um, it gives me an insight to things I don't think I would have it if I was just right after master's started my PhD. Um, I mean, you have already partially answered my question for the second question I had in my mind. What specific things motivated you to write this book at this time, at this juncture of the history that we are going through?
hmm. Um, Clearly, my own experiences with poverty as a child and later as an adult, and the fact that I'm in a relationship to people now who are not economically secure, affected my desire to know more about it. And I think that I felt very strongly that I could make a strong contribution to this area of scholarship based on what I've been reading over the course of my career. And of course, there's always the financial aspect. It's hard to do this research, and American University made some resources available to me that enabled me to work on this book.
Um, for our audience who haven't had the chance to read the book, or who'll probably not, how would you will not be able to afford this book? In other words, too, I wanted to say, um, how would you summarize, the key themes of the book? What are the things that you've explored, the research setting, kind of people that you have conversed with? What's the summary of the book for our audience?
Well, first, I'd like to say if people are in positions where they're not able to get access to the book, to please write to me, and I will work with the publisher to get the books into libraries and do what I can from my side of it to make it accessible. I think that's really an important thing. The book itself, over the course of a year, I traveled across the United States and I talked with people who live in communities that have struggled economically for decades, sometimes for really hundreds of years. And their stories are incredibly powerful in this book. The stories of what day-to-day life looks like, the kinds of experiences that they encounter every day. But because I connected their experiences to the institutions and structures that shape their experiences, the book turned out to be an examination of a nation in a deep economic and moral crisis. A nation in which the federal government and corporations collude together to maximize profits at the expense of people's health, their ability to make a decent livelihood, their educational opportunities, their environmental safety, the futures of their children, right? So it became something I didn't quite anticipate.
Um, you have explored in this book. So, what are some of the things? I wanted to ask this question later, but I won't ask now. That what are some of the things that you have found, researching this book that surprised you the most, that you did not think, even like you grew up in the United States, you grew up in not very comfortable
Right.
households. But what are some of the things that kind of surprised you, shocked you, even you being a sociologist?
Hmm. Honestly, I have to say just about everything I learned about indigenous communities in the US. Um, I expected to see high rates of poverty and unemployment. I didn't expect to see the enormous amount of victimization of indigenous peoples, sex trafficking of women. There's a huge crisis on native lands where more than 6,000 women were trafficked in a single year, and there's no one protecting them. There's no, the United States does nothing. Local communities do their best, but the federal government does nothing really to protect them in an adequate way. I was really surprised by the amount of violence directed to Native men, and how all of that gets really hidden from view. There's still the US legal structure is designed to exploit and underdevelop Native communities, and that's very visible in what it takes to open a business on reservations. I was also really surprised that in poor communities in Kentucky that families are trafficking their young children, so that around like the Kentucky Derby, they sell their children into sex work in order to earn money. Maybe for other reasons as well. Just the lack of regard for women is astonishing, and how that plays out in the lives of poor women is really devastating. I was also really surprised by how much of all of the realities of millions of people in this country are really hidden from view from most people, because they're not covered adequately in media, they're not talked about in government. So you have water crises across the country, toxic pollution levels that are life-threatening, low wages, a lack of health care. And if you don't actually live with these situations, chances are you don't know anything about them. And that is itself really disturbing to me.
My goodness. I mean, I'll make it sure that our students visit this conversation. Is, from Bangladesh, our understanding of United States is a land of milk and honey. It's a land of opportunity, and you are right. Is that how much of it is invisibilized, hidden from our reality, and particularly I think the um, hyper-connected social world doesn't do a good job either.
Right,
uh,
right. And
so
you're right in that when we look at other countries, we tend to see through a very particular lens. Poverty in the U.S. on reservations looks like the poverty you see in underdeveloped so-called third world nations. Right? It's extreme. When you look at how people live on less than $2 a day around the world, then in other places, what passes as poverty here might not seem as extreme. So I really want to think about process of inequality rather than absolute levels of poverty, because we have a small number of people who have become extremely wealthy by paying low wages, by depriving people of health care, that there is a system of exploitation at work. And we have greater levels of inequality in the US now than South Africa did during apartheid. Now that's shocking to me. And I think that gives us a different window into the land, the so-called land of milk and honey, right? Milk and honey for some, for sure.
oh my God. So I want, and if you, however extent you can, please help us understand it. Um, so in your book, you argue that the structural violence, the systemic inequality, the collusion of corporations and the government together benefits a few at the expense of majority. So does this mean in 2022 the American dream is dead?
Ah. Oh my gosh. Well, I think that when we talk about the American dream, we have on one hand um, a, a reality, an experience, and on the other hand, we have a capitalist ideology. So I want to start with that distinction. And as a reality, I would say that there are examples of people who have been able to find opportunities, create opportunities here that they weren't able to do in countries of origin. But it has never been a reality available to all people in the United States. It certainly is not a reality for Black and Brown people, and it has not been a reality for white women or for those born into poverty. We have very limited class mobility. So it is exactly those exceptions to the norm that keep that in place, right? The country depends on low wage workers in fields, factories, custodial services, service industry jobs. So there's that aspect of where you could argue about how available that reality of mobility is for people in the US. Certainly, it's becoming less and less the case. However, as a capitalist ideology, this myth of an American dream where all you have to do is work hard and you can succeed leads people who are not succeeding to blame themselves for being stuck in poverty. It leads them not to look at the social structures, the predominance of low wage work that they face, but to think about their own limitations. And as a result, not having enough becomes a matter of personal shame. And that stops people from organizing, it stops people from protesting. And it is, I think, great news that as a capitalist ideology, belief in the American dream is also weakening.
Um, in the 22 Edelman report, the famous Edelman report, and after the Seattle attack, when the NGOs stormed the WTO center. So they do this study, and it has some value, obviously. In the United States, in the past 21 years, people's trust in government is at historic low. And what is more astounding for me at least, as a
Mhm.
disinformation researcher, um, that you have governments like China and governments like United States, the beacon of democracy and what have you. People in the United States trust less their government than people in China. People in China, being a dictatorship in so many ways, trust their government. Do you think that this poverty that is happening in the United States, because not everybody has the privilege like you and me to be able to spend time understanding systemic inequality, study literature, we're privileged, but that does not happen for everybody. Do you think the backlash when we see discourses like make America great again, or when it comes to Britain, take back Britain, or in Canada, what is happening right now, you
Yeah.
know, do you see any connection between this backlash and poverty in this context?
That's a really big question. So let me try to take it in pieces.
Mhm,
One is you asked initially about trust in government and how it is that China, with a very oppressive government by
mhm,
many
mhm,
standards, people have
mhm,
confidence in it.
mhm,
I suspect they have confidence in it to be the way it is, right? I mean, you
mhm,
can sort of rely that it is going to do certain things,
mhm,
but also um, the confidence may. I think about confidence in government as part of a hegemonic process, right? So here we go to Gramsci and
mhm,
his theory of hegemony that enables governments to rule without physical force because the ideals, values, and priorities of that governing class become those of the workers, those of everybody else. So I don't know if you think about that. I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing when people have so much confidence in their government. I can't say. In the United States, I think that the gap between the the myths, the rhetoric, the discourses of government and of American life, the gap between those things and the reality of lived experience has become so great that it's really created enormous doubt for people. And here I want to say, when I say people, really we're talking about white people, because I don't believe that black and brown people ever had great confidence in this government, which has betrayed them left and right, right? But it is arriving in new ways in the lives of white people. So did I answer all your questions? There were a lot of questions in that one. Is there something that I've left out in
No,
my effort to?
yeah, you have answered it, very well. Particularly, this point is very important: is that the U.S. government, when they say, what's that, very famous American saying that life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, but not for everybody.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
that's important. Um, in your book, you explored that how power and politics have rigged American economic system. Can you explain it for us, please?
Sure. I'm happy to take a first run at it. It's a very complex process,
Mhm,
but most simply, excuse me, politicians receive substantial patronage from corporations. And as a
mhm,
result, they look the other way when corporations are violating laws, or when they are opposing us, a big pushback against rent control, right? And politicians allow that to happen because they are involved in that corporate system. They're no longer separate. And I'm not sure that they've been separate for some number of decades. So historically, in order to become elected, you need to have the patronage of corporations in order to get into office. So you see immediately how a culture becomes corrupted if you have privately funded elections. No matter that how many people vote for someone, it's the people who are funding them that are going to see those rewards. And we see this collusion between government and corporations, the consequences of that in the absence of a living wage, the absence of rent control, the absence of environmental protection, the absence of healthcare. But we also see it in the presence of an opioid crisis. We see it in the presence of high rates of hunger. We see it in the shortage of affordable housing, the water crisis across the country, and in states that actually sued the Government Environmental Protection Agency when it tried to protect people from the ravages of the coal industry. So, it shows up in so many different ways. And I try to take that apart in the book. So there are chapters that move through each of these issues and how it is that the government has in various ways worked with corporations to make these things possible.
In your analysis, so I think it's a Marxist interpretation that in conflict, in power, of control, the power of capitalism will win over the power of government, the capitalist co-option of the government. And it is not unique to the United States, it's in many, many countries around the world. When you were traveling for this book, particularly in rural parts of southern parts, sorry, when I say rural, I mean in my mind, because my research, I often think about the remote areas and rural areas. You saw Confederate flags. And you saw that people's reliance, and I want this question really to make sense for our audience and even for our conversation, is that you saw Confederate flags, you saw people relying on evangelical Christianities that so you went to a bookstore and somebody starts conversing with you, and in a minute that man's enormous confidence is that this store belongs to God, and his confidence in God. Can you please help us understand, navigate through this complexity between, in the midst of this unprecedented level of inequality, poverty, you go to southern area and you see Confederate flag, you see in the super powerful, passionate, evangelical Christians. How do you connect these dots to understand the poverty?
You are so good at complex questions. Let me see how I can take this apart in a couple of different ways. One is that where I saw evangelical communities predominantly was through Appalachia, and there is a long history of bigotry toward Appalachia and Appalachians that views them as being unchurched and in need of spiritual uplift, that brought in missionaries over a century of missionaries coming to kind of save people in Appalachia. So there's that kind of background that is happening. I think also there's steep levels of poverty. There's wealth as well, but there's a lot of poverty in Appalachia. In terms of white supremacy, I have to say, honestly and sadly, I see this absolutely everywhere. I wish that we could just say, oh, it's poor, uneducated white people who are bigoted or racist, but that's not the case. If it were the case, we wouldn't see it in academia. Right? We wouldn't see it in government. We wouldn't see it in corporations. But nobody seems to have the corner on racist attitudes. And so I certainly would not connect poor whites and racism any more than I would connect anyone else with racism, right? So evangelicals have a very particular way of viewing the world in which it is the Bible is to be taken literally, and that creates a lot of paradoxes for people who hold that faith, right? I talked to one woman who felt very strongly that it was, the word of God sort of thing, take it literally all the way through, and that led her to think hold some very bigoted views, a lot of homophobia, heterosexism, and I think racism that were kind of conflated in that. But she herself really enjoyed gambling, which is also something that's not allowed by the Bible. So, people negotiate. And I think that it's very easy for people to use religious beliefs to justify points of view that they had prior to even coming to that faith, or that support them in other kinds of ways. So I don't know how much of it is evangelicals. I know there are radical evangelicals that are definitely, in the front of the Trump movement and white supremacy, but there are also evangelicals that take religious practice very differently. So the connections among them are really complicated and not monolithic.
Um, i- so the reason behind I'm trying to understand this as well, is that what's scaring me in American politics right now is that Trump is getting back. He's organizing meetings. He is. I heard him saying, and CNN covered this, is that if he gets reelected, he is going to pardon the people who were involved in January 6th. The thing that when the reason why I am probably talking about evangelical Christianity's role in helping capitalism's causes. Uh, so, I mean, the part of the world where I come from, so I'm sure that you are familiar with Mother Teresa.
Mm.
So she has gotten a Nobel Prize, and the West holds her on pedestal, and what have you. But this is a woman who never had any hesitation to blatantly lie. She glorified poverty.
Yeah.
She glorified poverty. She thought is that people in Kolkata, the Bengali speaking part of India, uh, when they're suffering, God loves them. That's why they're suffering. But when it comes to her own treatment, she would come to the United States. She would fly in private jet. She didn't have any problem, qualms taking money from the most corrupt politicians of the world, and more interestingly, channel that money to Catholic uh, financial, reservoirs or whatever you say. So how do you? And that's what my worry about religion's usage. I mean, capitalism's use of religion to justify the existing poverty. When you talk to people, how did they come to terms with their own poverty, and who did they mostly blame for their poverty?
First, thank you for that commentary on Mother Teresa. I know that it's a really profound example of hypocrisy that we don't talk about very much. And to my mind, it calls up the difference between religion and spirituality, and that once spirituality becomes institutionalized as a religion, it becomes subject to all kinds of politics and political corruption. I think that you see that in the example that you just gave. It's not specific to Catholics. Certainly, that was a great example, but you can see that really in any religion, that there's a place where the institution itself becomes corrupt. In terms of how people across the country saw themselves, There wasn't anyone who described themselves as poor. They talked about struggling, not having enough to be able to confidently meet all of their bills every month, and being really thrown into financial danger by needing new tire for the car, or having a health problem because there was no savings, there was no uh, cushion to be able to deal with those things. So they saw themselves as struggling, not having made it, but not giving up. They worked constantly in a world that was really stacked against them. And I think for the most part, people believed that, um, you know, white people tended to believe that they would make it, that if they just kept going, kept trying hard enough, that things would get better. Native people certainly understood that racism was a driving force in their lands. Their lands are occupied, their resources are extracted against their wishes, they're exploited and denigrated. So they didn't have any illusions about what was happening in the country. When I talked with people who identified as Black or as African American, they also had a clear sense of the politics of racism and how that affects their ability to get out of economic struggle. But nobody said, yeah, I'm poor and this is who I'm blaming for it. Everyone wanted to do better. Everybody was trying to work with what they had to make a better way of life for themselves and their loved ones.
Um, and this is probably a very personal question. Um, to you, um, what's the difference between spirituality and organized religion, hence politics? I think. I cannot differentiate in my mind. I've tried a lot to differentiate between organized religion and its political economy. And irrespective of any faith, um, you choose to stay silent for thinking about the safety and security of your loved ones. But this is in any religion. Doesn't matter what religion it is. To you, what is the difference between spirituality and organized religion?
Um, Dang. All right. Um, I think of spirituality as a set of belief, an ontological set of beliefs about how the world operates and how I, as an individual, fits into that. Right.
Mhm.
Um, so whether I'm part of a collective, how I see my relationship to others, how I understand my relationship to the planet, how I understand, it's a relational ontology um, that we come into. Whereas I think to be a religion, you do need, as you said, a political economy. You need to have a structure that has to be funded. You need money. You need an organization. You have systems of power within that organization. And there you go, right down the slope, right? So it might have started with some, wonderful things. And you can think about my own faith, right? In Buddhism. Uh, the same is true, when you look at countries that have theocracies, right? You think of Tibet before the invasion, it was a theocracy. It's very different than spirituality. It starts there, but then it becomes so elaborated that in that elaboration, not only do you have the influences of power hierarchies and money, but you also have cultural aspects that come in. And those cultural aspects become embedded in ways that you might not expect in a spiritual practice.
And when I think about spirituality and organized religion and its politics association with it, I think of Trungpa, the spiritual materialism,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of understanding. So when I talk to my friends about, it's mental health or the difficulties of life, I talk about these three lords that your material lord, lord of your speech, understanding
Mm,
that how the not understanding, and which is your research, that the politics of language, weaponization of language. Um, and the third one is the lord of mind, that mind wants to be in a certain state. When I'm happy, I'm happy. When I'm not happy, I don't like it. Mind's
mm.
complaining. Obviously it comes from Buddhist philosophy. So that's something deeply worry reminds me, and also makes me think, is that spirituality, to me, is knowing certainly that I don't know,
Mm.
but religion comes from a place of conviction, which makes it cruel inevitably. Because
Hmm.
for something
Interesting.
to yeah, a conviction cannot come without cruelty, right? Because a conviction cancels all the other possibilities of being.
I think that's worth a conversation in itself. And you can see how easily I slipped into these conversations with
Mm,
people when I was traveling, right? To
mhm,
walk into someone's store and then to be talking about, her father's passing and the appearance of Jesus and whether she thinks there's a soul and what the soul is and all of those things. Because, fundamentally, we all have some kind of belief, even if the belief is not, we don't believe, right? There is
mhm,
some kind of
mhm,
thoughtful response there. And it's an interesting part of life at any time. But I think, especially now when we're faced with so many catastrophes,
mhm,
with the climate crisis, with economic troubles, with the amount of violence and racism, that thinking about how we understand ourselves in relationship to the world that we live in is a pretty fundamental conversation.
yeah, 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 yeah. In academia, you are a professor, you know it very well. We are told a lot of the times about the objectivity. You write
Mm,
about things and you distance yourself from, what you're writing.
right, right.
And you write an objective narrative of things that you're writing, right? So your own experience and your own subjectivity, how has your subjectivity helped you to understand, in your mind, in your view, to understand poverty in the United States when you were talking to them? Like, you understand the feel of it, you understand how viscerally these people's reaction help you to understand the subjectivity. If you were not, if you didn't have any ontological relationship, if you didn't know any of that, you think you wouldn't understand how your subjectivity has helped you to understand your research topic in your mind.
I'm going to take a long way around in answering this question, if I may.
Mhm, please.
First, as a sociologist, I don't believe that objectivity in any form is ever possible. We can mitigate our biases, our conscious biases, but we always view things from a positionality, right?
Mhm,
It's
mhm.
And that positionality shapes everything. And I think about the mathematician. Can't think of his first name right now. Ramanujan was his last, from
Ramanujan, yeah,
India,
yeah, yeah, Ramanujan,
right?
yeah. Mhm,
Who proved theorems that scholars at Oxford had struggled with, but they wouldn't accept his proof because he didn't use their system. He had to relearn and do it by their system, right? So there's
mhm,
always, even in mathematics, which we tend to think of as being very objective, it's always somehow culturally informed by our positionality. So for me, this context means it's really important to be self-reflexive when I enter a research project, to
mhm,
think about how I am positioned in relationship to whatever it is I'm studying, and to make myself accountable by making that positionality visible. So someone can say, well, you know, as someone did when we were discussing right before we came on the review, where someone said, I was a crazy Buddhist asking
mhm,
stupid questions about Christians, right?
Mhm.
Okay, I mean, I made that available. I don't agree with that, but
Mhm.
that's fair.
Mhm.
You get to
Mhm.
do that. So when we think about um, how we're positioned, so my own subjectivity enables me to, I think, become a trustworthy person in this
Mhm.
particular project. So
Mhm.
it includes being able to empathize and see connections, just as you were describing, right? But it, more importantly, I think, enabled me to see and respect boundaries. I can't I can't say that my experience is the same as anyone's experience that I talk to. We're all really different, and I was much younger then. Times were different, the contexts were different. So I don't want to project my experience into theirs or into their communities, but to be able to recognize, um, try to see them, to try to see the world as they do, and to really respect the boundaries that they set for me. So we use, as researchers, we use pseudonyms so that they're protected and they get to choose their pseudonyms. But asking strangers to talk with me about their experiences, very vulnerable experiences, many of which carry a lot of emotion, either anger or shame or, some kind of intensity, that's asking them to place an enormous amount of trust in me. And so, in order for that to happen, I have to prove myself to be a trustworthy person. And that is, I think, the core of um, why my own experience, my own subjectivity helped me in the interviews, because I know my own experience of feeling intensely vulnerable around these very issues.
Mhm. 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 Shame is a big one. Shame is a big
Mm,
one that,
yeah.
particularly, I have seen that poverty in the immigrant communities.
Hmm.
Because if you have made it from Bangladesh to the United States or in Canada, means you have made it. So back home, you have a certain, you're perceived in a certain way. Or
Hmm.
let's say, if you see regularly, you see Bangladeshis trying to cross Mediterranean to enter Europe, drowning and dying in Mediterranean Sea,
Yeah.
taking the most dangerous, perilous journey, risking their life to enter the United States, right? So, if you have taken that long journey and you have entered the United States, when you're experiencing what you're experiencing, um, it's shame. And the other thing, probably you heard it from your students. I mean, you have Bangladeshi students, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Um, if you are trained in social sciences like critical sociology, and you talk about structural violence, you talked about systemic inequality, you talked about capitalist exploitation, um, you are perceived to be hyper thinking, like, and you are too critical, you are too angry, you are analyzing it too much, uh,
Mm.
or in other words, you are negative. So this is something that I get a lot, but I say that, and I think it has got to do a lot to do with shame.
Yeah.
um, Here's a question from Preeti. Celine, I didn't read your book, but right now I'm really interested about it. But I want to know, how do you feel about information controlling what has been already done to particular organization like UN? Also to the food program, isn't it a kind of economic manipulation? For example, if you know what should be valuable in the next, then information manipulation isn't a great step to control economy.
Hmm. Thank you for that question. I'm not entirely sure that I understand it. So let me try to summarize what I think you're asking, and you can tell me if I'm correct. So that controlling information is a kind of economic manipulation, I think.
Mhm,
Is that what
mhm.
you're asking?
That's what I get it. That's how I also feel it. Mm.
Yeah. Um, it was, I think, Foucault who said that the greatest, or maybe it was Stuart Hall, that the greatest goal of power, people in power, is to prevail in determining what kinds of questions can be raised and how they can be raised, right? The struggle for power is always the struggle of control over meaning, which is why I love studying language so much, systems of representation. So absolutely, if you can't control an economic system unless you control the information about that economic system. And that's how we have gotten to where we are. You know, people believe that the world is made of atoms, but the poet Muriel Rukeyser said that the world is not made of atoms, it's made of stories. And I love that because even atoms have no meaning unless we have a narrative about what it is they mean.
I was teaching in a graduate class about critical discourse analysis. So I was telling them that human beings, we are crazy creatures. We live in two realities simultaneously. You can go out and you can touch a tree, you can feel water, but that's one reality. But the other reality is discursive reality, the meaning making reality. And that reality is so powerful that let's say that if I'm American and I value my flag and, you know, family and our forces, I wouldn't mind ending someone's life for that meaning called America. I'm an American. So, meanings, I mean, in my shallow ways, I say that language is the operating system of our actions.
It is. It is indeed.
Yeah.
And honestly, I would go a step farther that I could go outside and touch that tree. But when I touch that tree, is it cubits of lumber that I can use to build a house? Am I thinking how I'm going to cut it down and when I'm, like, or am I thinking that this is part of my spiritual community that I am going to cherish and protect? Or am I going to think this is a great picnic site? I'm going to sit down right here, right? Like all of that constructs the meaning of the presence of that tree. So I'm not ever suggesting that, there is no reality that exists, but that the reality only gains meaning through our conversations about it, our discourses.
Yeah, yeah, and our relation, you're absolutely right that it determines that when I'm speaking to you in our conversation, how am I seeing our intersubjectivity and interrelationality? That is also understood and communicated through language, and
Yes,
whether we are violent towards somebody or we are compassionate, caring towards somebody, that is also hugely governed by language.
that's right.
I want to
Very.
ask a methodological question for our suffering researchers. you know, if you are,
Okay.
so you chose institutional ethnography for this uh, research for this book.
Mhm.
Why did you choose this specific ethnography? Why over others?
It's the most consistent with how I study systems of meaning making.
Mhm.
I didn't want to ever place myself in a position of presuming to know better than the people that I interviewed.
Mhm.
I didn't want to put myself in a position of doubting whether or not what they were telling me was true, if it was as severe as they described it. I wanted to see the world as they saw it. So, in order to understand that, I look at how their experiences are shaped by the institutions that they participate in. Dorothy Smith wrote the first institutional ethnography. It's the field that she has pioneered, in which she was looking at how single moms were always being blamed for having children that were poorly prepared for school. They were kind of considered inadequate at parenting. And so she studied schools to understand how classrooms demand kind of a standard unit child, and that any child that doesn't fit into their needs or desires, the parent gets labeled as inadequate. And I think that that's really fair in looking at how these experiences that we have are shaped by structures, but then foisted back at us, right? So if the only job that you can possibly get within 150 miles of your home is a low wage service industry job, you will never get out of poverty. That is not going to happen. But how people think about that, their experience, right? People still get blamed for being poor, get blamed for not having more opportunities. Why don't they move? Why don't they go back to school? Why don't they, right? So wealthier others sit from the outside without understanding how those institutions are really shaping the experiences of people.
Um, this is going to be a very personal question, and I apologize in advance.
Oh, now you make me nervous. You already asked personal questions.
Okay. No,
Okay.
this is also connected to teaching. Like, you teach students, and you have a lot of international students.
I do.
And this is in my experience. I have seen that when international students come from, so I'll give example of Canada because I don't know the number figure for American university. So let's say for University of Toronto, if you're an international student, you have to pay annually the tuition fees nearly or above $70,000. Now that's only tuition fees.
Wow.
And then you have living and all the other costs. If one of your undergraduate student is studying at University of Toronto and her or his family can afford it, you can only understand that, okay, what kind of family privileges they come from. When they come here, you will see, unless and until they really do a lot of critical thinking, they will tend to, I'm not generalizing, I'm telling you based on my experiences, because I have been very passionately involved in equity, diversity discussions in the 2 different universities that I have been in Canada.
Okay.
When you teach international students who are wealthy, do you see that their understanding of poverty, they also tend to understand poverty from the dominant narrative, the meaning making? It seems like they also are internalizing a worldview which blames you are a black single mother. It's you are a what's that Ronald Reagan's, the administration's famous, portrayal that, the welfare queen, or,
Right. Right.
do you see that?
I see a couple of things. One is that not distinctive to international students, but to students generally, if you don't have experience with people and you haven't yet studied and learned, like opened your mind to different perspectives, that you believe what you have learned through media. So whatever it is that you're consuming, that's what you tend to believe about the world. And so those stereotypes, people bring them with them, without doubt. What I see very intensely in international students as well is a tremendous amount of shame around their wealth and an effort to kind of conceal the fact that they are so wealthy. And so there's kind of a tension between the sense of entitlement that comes with extraordinary wealth and a shame about making that wealth visible and feeling judged for it. So in my classes, I like to do a sociology. We don't ever talk about wealth. We don't talk about inequality in a concrete way. So I give students little note cards and I ask them to write down what the class, how much money their parents earn, what they think, what class that puts them in, and why they think this. No identifying. I collect all the cards, I shake them up, and later I pass them out, and we read them out loud, and we talk about, class and how hard it is. Kids are always saying, "Oh, my parents won't talk to me about how much they earn. I have no idea what class we're in." Those conversations never happen. But wealthier students will write horrible things that that they've been exposed, even though their name wasn't on it. They will then expose themselves and say, "This was a horrible exercise. I feel like I shouldn't have to talk about this. But if you wanted to talk to them about racism, they talk about that. If you wanted to talk, it's that complicated, messy nature of how we live.
Oh my God. The reason
This
I
resonates.
asked, oh, I mean, just go on, please go on.
No, please go. I see it resonates.
Yeah. So I asked this question, and I will keep saying, I think I feel a lot less intimidated by people's opinion because of my vigorous investigation or my passionate interest in Buddhist philosophy, for my own mental health, understanding what it is. Um, so a lot of the times, and I have learned to talk about my experience, and I have to thank many of my professors, sociology professors, who have given me the courage to help me gaining the courage, saying that, this is your experience, right? But then I have come from one of the most improbable places, from Bangladesh, here in academia. And when I talk about my experiences, my wealthy peer from similar background will tell you that, why do you sell your poverty?
Sell your poverty?
Yes, because my experience of growing up in abject poverty, growing up starving, growing up, in kinds of household, I often tell this. When I see people wasting food, it triggers me. It triggers me because as a teenager, one of the most difficult memories that I have is that after coming back from school, walking nearly 8 miles, you come home with a fear crippling your heart. Will you find food at home? When you don't find
Mhm.
food, you're up at night, not because of any kind of sadness, because of pure hunger.
Right.
Now I'm in my 40s. I go to your house. It's your food, you bought it. Let's say you're wasting it. It triggers me. It makes me sad when I see that food thrown in the garbage. Does it make sense?
I,
Um,
for very different reasons, yes, I share the same kind of trigger. Yeah.
um, it's so. I mean, I hear it, and I tell myself up. James Baldwin quote is that we humans, we're walking disasters and miracles at the same time.
I
So
like that very much.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I mean, I don't feel intimidated anymore. Yeah, I don't, and I think I read it from Tao Te Ching. That was, from Taoism. Is
Hmm.
that if I don't want to be prisoner of people's opinion, you can tell me all you want. Yeah. Uh,
Wow.
Sorry, Dr. Shongita has asked this question. I absolutely love the way which Dr. Pascal's critical insights address the central question around methodology and ethics. I hope there can be a separate conversation with her on questions around situated knowledge and methodologies in the context of engaging with people from margins.
Mm. Well, that would be very fun.
That would be
That's
fun.
a great conversation to have. I think that is a conversation that every scholar needs to be having if they're going to be doing field work. Absolutely.
Why does it not happen in your experience?
My experience is just my experience here. So I find that most sociologists do not think about methodology. They think about methods. They can tell you the details of what they're going to do. I've collected this, I went there, kind of like the recipe part of conducting research. But they have no training or awareness of methodology, of epistemology and ontology, and how that fits together. There might be some training in reflexive thinking, but it's fairly shallow if you don't also have an epistemic understanding of what it is you're doing. And why is that? Wow, I think it's systems of power within academia, right? So, one of my earlier books, I think my second book really takes this up and how it is that academia has um, colonized the whole research process, right? And so we are, as scholars, a product of a colonial mindset that privileges some kinds of information and marginalizes others. And what it privileges and marginalizes has to do with our research methodologies and methods.
And particularly because you are also very big on methodology, and I know that graduate students have told me, "Oh, I use Professor Pascal's work for methodology." So, you know,
Mm.
do you think, especially in digital research based on data, and there's a lot of social research that is happening based on data.
Mm.
I coin it this way, and I someday I would love to write on it, that the digital gentrification through the process of methodology. So what do I mean? Let's say that you're studying poverty, you're studying
Mm.
any particular issue. Now you might say, oh, from Bangladesh, nearly 120 million people are connected to internet. So if you collect all that data, that gives me, this, or from this data I understand this. But then we're not asking questions: who are the people that got ignored in the process? Do they have the skills necessary to be able to participate in digital spaces meaningfully? In traditional ethnography, you can ask deeper questions, follow-up questions. As a researcher, you collect data, there are visible expressions. There are so many data that we collect when we're, doing ethnography. But when we are taking decontextualized digital data turned into ones and zeros, are we not invisibilizing huge groups of people? And then this knowledge becomes the discourse that mediates our world.
Right, right. Well, I think you have described that very well, and I look forward to reading your book when you put that together. I think that's a really worthy topic, and it's totally consistent with the way that we think about every production as also being an active erasure. Right? We can't include everything. There's always something left out, and there's a politics to be struggled for over what gets left out, who gets left out, on what terms they're left out. In my own research for this book, I had trouble with institutional funding because I wanted to give gift cards to people for their time, because it feels to me really important to be able to reciprocate in, even if it's only a symbolic way, right? Here's $40 for having spent some time with me to do the formal interviews. And in order to do that, it took me months of struggle and cross-institutional allies, because there is an understanding that if you're going to give money to research participants, you have to have their social security number, you have to have their address, and then they're going to get a tax form. Well, nobody was ever going to talk to me if I wanted their social security number. Who would do that? Give a stranger a social security number? Like, that's a non-starter. Then many of the people I talked to didn't have a written address. They were like the third blue house from the, like there aren't street names, there aren't addresses in that way. So trying to change the ways that we do research depends also on changing the ways we think about how we fund research. So it kind of runs through everything, and that would be that's why I love the question that came up, and I hope that we have time to do that at some point in the future, to have a conversation about bigger epistemic issues around scholarship.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Professor Pascal, for making some time for us. And I'll just talk to you for 1 minute before I let you go. And thank your audience for staying with us and asking great questions. And obviously, I will also share with you, how our students take parts of it and produce their own understanding. So thank you very much once again, Professor Pascal.
Thank you, and many thanks to everyone who joined us. I've enjoyed it enormously, and I appreciate the thoughtfulness of all the questions.